news. Take the bad news. The bad news has to be leaked.
Bad news last week.
Here's the bad news.
The bad news. The bad news.
Good news, bad news. What do you want first?
I always want the good news. What's the bad news?
Bad news, crazy.
I have some very sad news for all of you.
Bad news.
More bad news.
Bad news travels fast.
Sometimes there's bad news, it goes up. It's good news like this, it goes down because...
What's the good news?
Well, there's some bad news first.
Where have you been? Where have you gone?
That's bad news.
Bad news.
Good news I could do over the phone. Bad news I do in person.
Extremely bad news.
It's going to be very bad news.
Good news and bad news.
When they get bad news.
The bad news, though.
No, it's going to be bad news. And I thought, boy, that was bad news.
Do you love me like I love you?
Bad news.
There's good news and bad news. I'm going to start with the bad news.
And the bad news is...
I have some bad news.
Some good news and some bad news. The bad news is...
Well, I have bad news.
When the bad news comes.
Would be bad news for all.
I have some bad news for you.
The bad news is... That is really bad news. Bad news.
I have good news and I have bad news.
That's bad news.
Hey, well, I got some bad news.
Bad news. The bad news.
Bad news for you. I do have a bit of bad news.
And I got bad news.
May have been bad news for...
I'm afraid there's bad news.
Bad news.
That could actually be really bad news.
Well, I got some bad news for you.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news. The bad news.
Bad news is bad news. Bad news.
It's bad news.
I got some good news. I got some bad news.
Some really bad news.
More bad news.
There's bad news and more bad news.
There's bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Was bad news.
Bad news. Bad news. Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news. Bad news.
Bad news.
Here's some good news.
I'm going to.
Please.
I'm going to.
I have bad news and worse news.
If that's the bad news, what could be worse?
Now we've really got some bad news. I've got bad news.
Possible bad news.
Bad news. The bad news.
More bad news.
There's bad news and bad news.
More bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Which is bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news. So bad news.
Bad news. Bad news. Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Bad news.
Some bad news.